favorite, least favorite sci-fi RPGs, movies, comics, that kind of stuff?
Sure.
Sound like a plan?
Everybody cool? All right. All right. Anybody else with anything else in the pre-show before we hit the road?
Actually, we're on the road. Go for it.
Oh, we're live. Hey, you keep sneaking up on me with that. Hey, folks, thanks for tuning in to the BAMF podcast. I'm your host, Mike Lafferty. That was my sassy co-host, Walt Billiard. Hey, Walt.
Can't prove a thing.
Yeah. And here today we have a very special guest, Mr. Owen Stephens from Paizo. Hey, Owen.
Hey, folks. How y'all doing?
Well, great. Thank you very much for coming out to me with us today. You've got a resume in the RPG is about as long as my arm, so I can't dive into it too. But obviously, you're working for Paizo. You were one of the big developers on Pathfinder. Now, if I understand correctly, you're the main developer for Starfinder?
My official job title is design lead. I share the development and design duties with Rob McCreary, who is our creative lead.
Okay, cool. Also joining us today is Mr. Jacob Blackman. Jacob, how you doing?
Doing pretty well. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, Jacob's a frequent co-host, and Jacob, you do a lot of art. I guess actually for Owen, for your guys' little side hustle at Rogue Genius Games, right?
Yeah, we got. I'm currently doing a lot of work for not only my usual line of superpowered legends, but right now Owen is preparing some third-party material that's going to be available for Starfinder, and I'm working my tail off on that.
Cool. All right, well, welcome again. Also, we've got Mr. Aid Smith joining us from across the pond, where it's much later. How you doing, Aid?
It's good. It's later, and it's also very, very warm for some reason. Don't know why that is.
That's odd because it's been colder and wetter than usual in Denver, so I guess we got your weather.
We're obviously absorbing your heat through the atmosphere of the planet, and that's what it is.
That sounds scientific. Let's go with it. So, all right. Wait, let's just dive into it. We're here to talk Starfinder, which is the big shakes in RPGs right now. And I actually, you know what? I've noticed we do a thing in podcasts sometimes where we don't always properly introduce what we're talking about. And I know sometimes as a listener, if I don't, I'm like, hey, what is this thing? And I'm guessing 99% of our listeners know what Starfinder is. But there's one guy somewhere who's like, what the fuck? So, Owen, could you give a brief introduction just in case someone's a newbie to the Starfinder world, just telling them what it is and what's coming out?
Sure. So Starfinder comes out August 17th, which happens to be the first day of Gen Con, and we will be releasing it at Gen Con. And Starfinder is a new role-playing game from Paizo Publishing, which is set way in the future of the same universe as the Pathfinder role-playing game. So it is a science fantasy game where there are, of course, plasma swords and starships and faster light travel and psychic powers, etc. But there are also still elves and dwarves and gods and divine powers, and all of that stuff is mixed together into one action-adventure exploration RPG, which is evolved from the Pathfinder rules. So it is its own role-playing game. It's got a fair amount of backwards compatibility, especially when it comes to like monsters. But we did go back to the drawing board and look at all of the decisions we'd made and reconsider them in light of the time and effort that we have put into the Pathfinder RPG over the years. And I've actually I have a copy of it right here if anyone has not seen the beautiful cover art.
That is some nice cover art.
That's pretty.
And
I'll take one of those, please.
If you're mailing those out, yeah. We should tell our listeners that whiteboard you see behind Owen doesn't contain any development secrets or meta plot developments, so don't look too closely at it because you're not going to find anything. So nothing to see there, folks. Move along.
It's cool.
Wow, that hit hard.
Yeah. So
I'm playing the Space Goblins.
The who?
The Space Goblins. Haven't you been reading the Paizo blogs? For God's sakes, man.
The Space Goblins are adorable.
Oh my God.
There was a long conversation about whether or not there would be space goblins, and we made an effort to exterminate space goblins, but it turns out goblins are the fantasy race equivalent of cockroaches. If you see one goblin, that means you've got 10 more in the woodwork somewhere. So try as we might, space goblins with grenades and pretty janky laser pistols and big bubble helmets with tape on them to keep them from cracking are a thing in Starfinder.
Well, I mean, I understand you guys have the golem as sort of, your corporate logo, but you're very close associated with goblins.
The golem is our logo. I think of goblins as our mascot.
That's fantastic.
I'd have to agree on that. Considering I have two Pathfinder Goblin toys up on the shelf over here, and I don't have a Paizo Golem anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, there are plush goblins, there are resin goblins, there's a goblin statuette with a giant D20 on it. Goblins are popular. Our goblins are especially popular. And it turns out, as a business, Paizo likes to make money. And our publisher, Eric Mona, has a pretty simple philosophy. Make things people want and then trade it to them for money. That is actually our business plan.
You know, not every RPG publisher has that, so I'm glad you guys have that kind of, vision.
Yeah, the sad thing is, you're not joking. Not every RPG, and if someone wants to hobby publish, that's totally fine. I'm not trying to be a gatekeeper here, but you do need, even when you're making games, even when you want to add fun to the world, if you want to keep paying people salaries, you need to keep an eye on the bottom line.
I know more than 2 publishers who've been in the business for more than 10 years who had some problems with their Kickstarters, and talking to them later, they were like, I forgot to budget in money to pay myself. And yeah, it's a thing. So, all right. So a quick question that I'm wondering personally, let's say I'm playing Pathfinder with a bunch of my friends, Starfinder comes out. Part of me wants to do a shot of Jaeger and just say time travel adventure. Is that a bad idea?
So when we were doing things like the classes and the races in Starfinder, we were trying to do the ones that we think make sense in Starfinder. So yes, a soldier is in many ways similar to a fighter. They have, if you will, the same ecological niche. They're not the same class. They work differently. They have somewhat different focuses. And those are probably the two that are closest. We've got the Solarian, the Mystic, the Technomancer, and these are all as a result of at least centuries, if not thousands of years of evolution and change and cultural mingling, different classes. So we have a chapter called the Legacy chapter that gives you all the rules you need for playing dwarves and elves and halflings and gnomes and half-orcs and half-elves. So that's not an issue. Those races are still around. But if you are playing a magus who has the Kensai archetype and has picked up 9 spells from Ultimate Combat, Ultimate Magic, and the Advanced Class Guide, we don't have equivalents for that stuff in Starfinder at this point. We give you guidelines on how to do that kind of conversion work if you want to. And I'm pretty sure there are people who will do it and will have a good time with it. But we're talking about a core rule book right now, and Pathfinder has, dozens of rule books. So we obviously have not hit the same breadth of concepts that they have. If you're willing to do that conversion work, you certainly can take those characters and play them in a Starfinder game. I think you could have a lot of fun. I also think that saying, well, this Lazor pistol does not work like my crossbow, and I don't know how it functions, and everything is strange and new to me, would get old pretty soon. So you're either going to want to hand wave that a little bit and say, you spend 3 months on Absalom Station getting used to things, or assume that when you translate to the future, your skills get updated.
Okay, cool. Well, hey, not to be abrupt, but I out on Reddit, I had gone into the Starfinder subreddit and said, hey, anyone got questions for Owen? And I got a long list. Are you cool if I start working down that?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. From user, oh man, if I say all these names, I'm going to get them all wrong, aren't I? User Sabas Pep. With tons of alien worlds, we should expect tons of alien languages. Have the rules, feats, gear been changed at all to reflect this? We've seen the quick pigeon ability that the Xenoseeker gets. Are there more mechanics similar to this?
So the pigeon ability is a special ability that you get for the Xenoseeker theme. So that's not universal. That's an advantage they have. The core rulebook assumes that you are operating in the core game area, so mostly the Pact worlds. And you can move beyond those, but that's like moving beyond the map of Galarian. You're going to run into stranger and stranger things. Within the Pact worlds, much as English has become pretty well accepted in a large part of the world, especially if what you are doing is dealing with upper-level experienced adventuring folks, there are a few common languages in the Pact worlds that are going to let you operate pretty smoothly. Yes, if you move to a brand new planet and we introduce a brand new race, that race is probably going to have a brand new language. And something like the pigeon ability is actually what you want to get to be able to communicate with them. Some magic can do that, but all of our spellcasters are spontaneous spellcasters, which means you have to pick your spells in advance. So it's more of a dedicated idea if you want to be able to communicate with multiple people using magic. We don't currently have universal translators, though I presume something like Google Translate is available, and the GM can handle that however they want to. Again, try as we might, we can't get absolutely everything into one rule book. This thing's more than 500 pages long as it is. We had to put in an entire role-playing game, plus an entire Starship combat game, plus the basics of a setting. So there are going to be areas where we will expand more as we tell stories and move on.
Okay, cool. Next question from the same dude. What changes between Pathfinder and Starfinder were you most surprised by? Which innovations are they most proud of?
Wow. I don't know that I was surprised by any of them because, I mean, I've been on this project since day one, so I know where everything evolved from. I will say that one of the things I'm most proud of is how we are handling archetypes. And in Pathfinder, archetypes aren't even in the core rulebook. They didn't come along until the Advanced Player's Guide. We have the general rules for archetypes and 2 archetypes in the core rules. The thing about how we're doing archetypes in Starfinder is that every archetype can be taken by every class. Now, we may later do a few exceptions to that. We might end up having, hey, here's a spellcasting archetype, and obviously that only makes sense if you are a spellcaster. But the general idea is, instead of in Pathfinder, where if we decide we want, hey, here's a Warlord of Damortosh, which is a Vesk Battle Lord archetype. In Pathfinder, we would have to do 1 for the fighter, and 1 for the ranger, and 1 for the war priest, and 1 for the cleric. And that means that either they take up a huge amount of room, or we have these things that are supposed to be cultural touchstones that only a tiny percentage of characters can do anything with. So in Starfinder, the way we've done things, although we only have 2 archetypes in the core rulebook, all 7 classes can take them. So instead of having 7 possible class archetype options, you've got 21 because you can do no archetype or the Phrenic Adept or the Starfinder Forerunner. And so that gives us a much broader range of possible builds in a much smaller area.
Okay. Cool. Sometimes people will call Pathfinder, D&D 3.5 or 3.75. If you were to, since Starfinder is kind of an additional step of refinement, would you call it, D&D 3.8, 3.87, 3.92?
I've actually gotten my notes in a few places. I've referred to it as 3.x. It's sort of not our decision how far from 3.5 or 3.p, which is what I think of Pathfinder, Starfinder is. That's sort of the fans' decision. We've definitely done some things differently, refined some things, made some changes. So it is another step down the line. But I don't know that it's really accurate to suggest that we are moving closer and closer and closer to some perfect 4, because D&D 4 was something very, very different. So I like 3.x as some variable amount of polish since the original D20 system engine was put together.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I was just being sassy there. So Starfinder, and this is from user, I like this name, Cygnus300. That sounds like a funk band. Starfinder will have PFS scenarios in Path, but does Paizo plan to release content of a middle length like the modules in Pathfinder?
So we are looking very, very carefully about what is a sustainable level of Starfinder content. So, for example, our adventure paths aren't as long as the adventure paths in Pathfinder are. The first one is 6 adventures long, but each adventure is a little shorter. That is in part based on what we think we can sustainably write and edit and develop and put out on a schedule and maintain the level of quality we want to. And it's in part because we had a lot of feedback from people saying, hey, I love all the material that you're producing for Pathfinder, but it takes us a year or a year and a half to run through an adventure path, and you are putting out 2 adventure paths a year every year, so we're never going to catch up. So right at the moment, we haven't announced any plans for any adventures other than the Starfinder Society scenarios, and we will be doing one of those a month. So that's monthly adventure content. And the adventure paths, which are a series of connected adventures. The first one, which is Dead Suns, is 6 adventures long, but we are releasing those one every other month. Obviously, Paizo is a business, and as a business, we like to make money. And our publisher, Eric Mona, has a pretty simple business plan, which is to make things people want and trade it to them for money.
Yeah, that sounds familiar.
Yeah. So if we find that there is a demand for mid-length things like modules, we'll look around and see if it makes sense to either stop doing something else we're doing in order to do those, or hire more people to do them, or change what our other internal publishing plans are. But we're talking about a game we haven't even released yet. so it's a little hard for us to predict what is the highest demand going to be, and we sort of want to allow that to evolve naturally rather than trying to dictate how much of this the market will buy.
Okay. From username Nutalfun, is there an alien section in the core book, and are we waiting for the alien archive and using what's in First Contact and the adventure path until then?
We're waiting until Alien Archive, and we're using the First Contact, which is a free PDF you can get on Paizo.com.
Okay.
Until then.
Gotcha. How early does power armor become available?
So it sort of depends on what you mean by that. One of the fighter types sort of gets advantages in heavy armor that make it act a lot like power armor early. And again, this is the base. I'm literally looking this up, by the way. The book's right here. This is the core rules, so we may well add more powered armor later. You can normally expect to sometimes buy things about one level higher than your personal level. And that's just a matter of finances and availability. There's no, if you happen to find a 15th level laser gun and you're second, you can use it. That's just like finding a +5 Vorpal longsword as a second level Pathfinder character. So the very first thing that is considered powered armor is a level 4 item. So it could come in the game as early as 3rd if you were really dedicated or you found it as treasure. And the cargo lifter, as it might sound, is not really a combat model, but you can look an alien in the eye and tell it to get away from her. The battle harness is 5th, spider harness is 10th, flight frame is 11th, and the Jarl Slayer, which is a dwarven-built suit of powered armor that is traditionally shaped like a stocky, heavily armored dwarf with articulated hands, is a piece of 15th level equipment. So there's not a lot of powered armor in the game to begin with. We sort of wanted to cover it, but we also have armor upgrades, and this is the table of armor upgrades.
That is a large table.
If you want a flight pack or an ammo feeder or a force field generator or a quick release weapon sheath, these are things that you can do on your armor. So it is quite possible to take heavy armor and end up having your heavy armor, which is not officially powered armor, fly you around with a laser cannon built into it and a tracking system and a targeting computer, et cetera, et cetera.
So close enough.
Close enough.
All right. And let's see. Not all fun also asks, will I get to fight a Balrog wearing power armor with a Vorpal chainsaw and energy whip? And I think we just answered that with your with that table you showed us there. So he has a question about pawns, but the pawn list is already available and includes starships. From, this is a naughty name, the Ousehole. I'm guessing he's from Australia. The Ousehole. Are the schools of magic still intact? Is necromancy more of a magic thing or a technology thing? Which class is most likely to have access to necromancy options? So he likes zombies.
Necromancy is still a thing. We kept the schools of magic. We don't have the school-based specialization for our classes the way, say, the wizard does, because that's sort of a wizard-specific concept. You don't see bards specializing in schools of magic for the most part. They just have a separate list. And our 2 spellcasters do have a separate list. Actually, both classes have a fair amount of access to necromancy, and there may be a few like scare, fear type necromancy spells that are one or the other. I don't have the lists memorized, sadly. But for example, the ability to control and create undead are pretty available to both mystics and technomancers. Mystics, of course, are based on the concept that they use magic to explore the connections between things. And that is pretty obvious that if you can make a connection between the living and dead, that gives you the undead. Technomancers are more technology-focused spellcasters, but one of the things that they can do is use technology to augment their traditional magic. So they too can do things like create undead. And the Bone Sages, who are necrovites, a form of space leech on the planet of Eox, have electroencephalograms instead of phylacteries. So they've got a technological device, which is where they store their stole as part of the process of becoming undead. So both those classes have a fair amount of access to necromancy magic.
I think I was hearing heavy metal power chords as you were speaking that last sentence.
I sure hope so.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome. Okay, let's see. Next questions. We're getting towards the bottom. Nagatamen 715 wants to know if there's going to be a character sheet in PDF form posted online. He's hoping to see them before release so they can get ready for launch day games.
I'm sure that there will be one. A question of when actually isn't something I can answer. there's an upside to releasing a game at Gen Con, and that is that everyone is hyped. We will have thousands of copies there at the show. A lot of people will be able to show up and immediately play with people. We've got a great venue to do organized play adventures there in the Sagamore Ballroom. If you happen to be at Gen Con, come say hi. And we'll have pre-gen characters that you can use. The drawback is that means that we have to get ready for the first day of this game being available. At the same time, we are getting ready to move thousands of products and dozens of people halfway across the country, and that means that everybody in the company is doing double duty. Everyone is really busy, and since I'm not the one that literally puts these things up on the website, I just can't tell you what the timing of that's going to be. We'll make it as close to day one as possible, but if it doesn't happen until after Gen Con, it'll be because we were incredibly busy also handling Gen Con.
Yeah, I would foresee you guys being like crazy busy all through that whole convention.
You're pretty crazy.
And for those who have never been to Gen Con, it's already nuts. And the fact that this is the 50th anniversary, and I think every day is currently sold out with the exception of Friday. I think Friday is the only badge that hasn't sold out yet.
Which means we're probably talking about 70,000 people descending upon Gen Con.
Easily.
Yeah. All right. Next question. What race do you enjoy the best?
So I'm kind of an old school kind of guy, and I'm one of the people that very strongly felt we needed the original Legacy Pathfinder races in the book. So the honest answer to that is dwarf. I got to do the adaptation of the dwarf. We have an awesome piece of art of the dwarf, which is a dwarf in powered armor ready for asteroid mining. And if I can find it quickly enough, I'll actually show it to you guys, because we previewed that a few times. If you're talking about of the new races, and by new, I mean the ones that weren't originally core, because several of them are races that we had in supplements of Pathfinder, I'm a big fan of the Kasatha. I like the philosophy of the Kasatha and the backstory. They actually arrive in the Galarian system in a generation ship, which I think is neat. And they are also the people that brought the concept of Solarians and the philosophy of the cycle to the Pact Worlds. So I am pleased by how they have had a major impact. And let's see if we can, yeah, here's our dwarf.
Okay, yeah, nice art.
And if you can't see it, that shoulder patch, that's a mining pick and an asteroid.
Yeah.
It's a good idea of what dwarves are doing in Pathfinder and Starfinder.
Yeah, cool. All right. I like dwarves too. So, all right, moving on. From Sparflingo. Is the Adventure Path release date always going to be a 2-month wait between chapters? I think we covered that earlier. Or do they plan on increasing it to a monthly release like Pathfinder?
So for the first 6 issue, I'm quite sure we're going to stick with one every other month. That gives us a year to see how quickly are people playing through these, what's the level of interest, how long does it take us to get more chapters put together. So right at the moment, we've certainly not announced that we are changing that schedule at any point, and I would be shocked if we changed it before we were done with the first Adventure Path. After that, the smart people here that make these decisions and pay my checks might well decide that something else makes more sense, in which case we would definitely let people know that probably on our blog.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. From username Wickren. Do an android's physical injuries persist through the phases of renewal?
Do their memories persist?
Sorry, physical injuries.
Oh, not mostly. We don't go into a lot of detail about that. So normally when you wake up through renewal, you're whole and hale and hearty. But we don't say that you are absolutely magically fixed. It's just that is usually when androids decide to go through renewal. So if someone wanted to tell a story that took that element and did something different with it, that would certainly be something that they could do. That's largely a GM call. And we're trying to leave GMs a lot of flexibility on how this world works, because it's an entire galaxy. It's not a world. And there's no way we will even cover a tiny percentage of the number of things you can run into in a galaxy when we say that even this one solar system has dozens of intelligent species. So there's a lot of room for GMs to tell the sorts of stories they find interesting and to help players tell the sorts of stories they find interesting.
Okay. From username Jimsy the Murph. We've heard a lot about classes, races, and gear, but not so much about feats and spells. Are there any significant changes to either of those?
So the major differences to spells, there's sort of a thematic difference and there's some mechanical differences. The most important mechanical difference is that there are no longer components. There aren't any components. There are no verbal components. There are no somatic components. There's no material components. If a spell would have in the old days had a focus or some other expensive material component, that's just a written requirement that's put into the body of the spell. So you don't have to wiggle your fingers just right and say exactly the right words. We also don't make any distinction between arcane, divine, and psychic magic. In the far, far future, magic is magic, and people are more worried about what their tradition of magic is than theirs. We're talking about the classes, mystics, and technomancers, than what the source is. And the advantage of that is that if a player wants to play a mystic, and that mystic happens to be a priest, and that mystic happens to be a priest of a psychic god, they can say, my mystic has psychic powers, without having to say, well, I am worshiping the god of psychic power, but my own power is obviously divine, because that's how clerics work in Pathfinder, for example.
Okay.
We only have spontaneous spellcasters, at least in the core rulebook. The spell lists, therefore, basically go up to 6th level. We have 6th level spellcasters. The thing about 6th level spellcasters is it means we get to give them more interesting other things. It is hard to take a 9-level spellcaster and give them a lot of options beyond here are yet more spells you can do things with. The spells otherwise are pretty recognizable. There's some changes on how we did the math and the saving throws, but that's all behind the scenes stuff, so it doesn't make a difference when you are picking and playing one. Feats, the major change about feats is that we have tried to keep all the feat chains short. So I think the longest feat chain is 3. The vast majority of them are either 1 or 2. 1 meaning there is no feat chain. And most of these don't have a lot of prerequisites. We've got ability scores in several cases, and very few have something like there's a feat that requires you to have 4 arms, but it doesn't say you have to be a Kasatha, because if you're a human, you could buy 2 new cyber arms. Now you've got 4 arms. Now you can qualify for the feat. So we tried to keep the restrictions dialed way back and make the feats better balanced and more equally in utility.
Okay, all right. From user Sabbaspep again. We've been told the Starfinder Society is going to show up a lot in the first AP. How much will Starfinder factions play a role in that story?
The factions won't play a significant role in the first AP. The factions are largely things that we are letting the Starfinder organized play group deal with, Starfinder Society. Mm-hmm. Just because it's difficult to coordinate their needs and our needs at exactly the same time. So there's some involvement in the first AP because that's the name of our entire game. But the sort of backstory political stuff is very much more things that they are going to be addressing and doing interesting things with in Starfinder Organized Play.
Okay, all right. From user Lonut Row, are cantrips still a thing?
Yes.
Okay. Can Starfinder be used for a modern game with little changes?
So the main thing about trying to use Starfinder for a modern game is that the special abilities and equipment all assume a very advanced level of technology. So at first level, you can buy a laser pistol, and by 5th or 6th, I'm not sure when, you can have a plasma cannon. If you simply strip those things out of the game and restrict people to semi-automatic pistols and machine guns and get rid of chainswords and such, not only are you cutting down the amount of equipment they have, especially with things like armor and flight packs, but they have special abilities that connect to those things. So the Technomancer, for example, has spells and class features, and for that matter, so does the Mechanic has class features, that are designed around the idea, oh, if you have an energy weapon, you can boost it in the following ways. Now, those are mostly things you select, so the player could just not pick them, but it does mean that you are narrowing the scope of things that you can do with the game. If you and your players are excited by that, then sure, you can absolutely do that. And I would presume that in the Starfinder universe, there are worlds that only have that level of technology.
Okay.
But one of the reasons we incorporated a campaign setting in the core rulebook is that I feel that a science fiction game really needs to give you some feel for what kind of science fiction it's going for, even more than a fantasy game does. So we wanted to give you that backdrop so we could say, this is the world, the universe we assume you're playing in. And it is easier for you to say, well, if I decide I don't want androids, I also have to look at, does that mean I don't want to have artificial personalities and computers? I don't want the sentient robots of the Anacytes, et cetera, because those are all in the setting.
Okay, all right. I'm not sure this last question might be one we want to defer. It's is there anything you would have liked to have done differently about the game?
Oh, I'm happy to answer that question. Yes.
That is a well woven political answer.
Okay,
and
moving
that's
right.
just
But while it may not be able to, I'm assuming while you may not be able to run a modern game because of all the stuff you say you have to take out, you could certainly do something like more like Cyberpunk or Shadowrun.
Sure. We tried very much to make Starships something that the GM decides that you are a Starship-themed game, or he decides you're not a Starship-themed game. So the big difference between Shadowrun and Warhammer 40K, besides whether or not there is a vast set of chaos gods and a horrible reality that I'm sure they first discovered in the movie Event Horizon, other than that, the other big difference is whether you're on one world or thousands. You could take a 40K Space Marine and drop him as a street samurai who happens to be a genetically engineered cyborg with powered armor and military-grade equipment, and he works just fine conceptually. So those ideas all work fine together. If you want to do Shadowrun-style Cyberpunk, you can even do non-Shadowrun-style Cyberpunk. I already know people who are in the playtest who are running games where they are doing their best to strip magic out of the game. And stripping magic out of the game has the same kind of problem that you have when you try and make it a modern game, and that means a lot of options that the game assumes are there aren't, and there's nothing immediately to replace them. But unlike in Pathfinder, where that sort of becomes almost unplayable unless you make some huge differences, they're actually not having those problems because of how we're doing damage differently and the fact that advanced technology can solve some of those niches. If you need your characters to fly and you've got jetpacks, then the fly spell isn't as important as it was in Pathfinder.
Okay, all right. Two last questions from username Krillholder. If he's not wearing his Paizo hat, and I don't see you wearing a hat, anything we don't know about the Starfarer's Companion, Blood Space, or Nebula Imperius that he is dying to tell us? I assume it's a product.
So here's the thing.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a product from a third-party company, Rogue Genius Games. I happen to be the publisher for that company. But I'm currently at Paizo. This is physically a Paizo office, so I am currently on the clock at Paizo, which means my Paizo hat, though invisible, is firmly in place. I will say there are a lot of third-party publishers that are putting out some stuff that looks very exciting. I've seen some of the previews that Legendary has put out. I know that there are other people that are and I know Frog God Games was talking about putting out some stuff. So I think there's going to be a lot of really robust third-party support, and there's a forum for that at Paizo.com. You can go to the Starfinder section and scroll down a little bit, and they've got the third-party Starfinder forums. And there's a lot of good information about a lot of people's releases there, including someone who's done a roundup of everything that's currently been announced that person can find. So while I don't feel it would be appropriate for me, while taking Paizo's time on the clock, to talk about other game companies I happen to work for, I am happy to say, as a Paizo employee, that we are working with third-party publishers to have day one third-party support of a high quality with some of our partners that have done wonderful stuff for Pathfinder, and I think there's going to be a lot of stuff out there that people will be excited by.
Okay, all right. Fair enough. Last question from Wrench Daddy. And this was the one I alluded to in our pre-show. How the hell does Starstone get up into the space station?
So in the Starfinder continuity, there is an event called the Gap. And during the Gap, all information about what happened, regardless of the format, regardless of how you try and get it, is gone. And even if you use powerful divinations to speak with demons and gods, all they say is, we can't talk about it. One of the things that happened during that time is that Golarion, the planet that is where almost all of the Pathfinder stories occur, disappeared. People can confirm that it still exists and the people on it are fine, but not what happened to it or when it happened or how it happened. And when people woke up the morning of the first day after the Gap, with no idea what had happened in their lives, and yet still knowing what their names were and what their job was and whether or not they liked chocolate ice cream, the Absalom Station already existed at that moment, looked like it had been lived in for a while, was in the orbit where Golarion used to be, and the Starstone was already in it, although no one knew that immediately. So the question of how did the Starstone end up going from the Starstone Cathedral in Absalom to the Absalom Station is not one that anyone currently has an answer for.
Okay, so that sounds like that might be a thread in a future adventure or a source book or something.
Well, I mean, it might be. So there are some big mysteries in Pathfinder, like where did the Eye of Abendigo come from? What's going on in there? Why did Aerodin die? How did Aerodin die? Is that why the Age of Omens didn't come about, et cetera, that haven't been the focus of anything. They are part of the background. In most major settings, there's something you don't know. And that, in a certain extent, tries to replace some of the things that go on in the real world, right? There are physics questions and philosophical questions and bits of history that are so far that we just don't know the answers. The way that Paizo tells stories tends to include having those big questions, but that doesn't mean we have any intention of focusing on them at any particular time, because we're now 300 years past the gap. That's just a thing that people are born being aware. Oh yeah, 300 years ago, no one knows what happened for some unknown period of time that we think may have been thousands of years, but that doesn't affect the price of rice here in Absalom Station. So for the most part, if you're part of the Starfinder Society, then that's a fascinating question. But even they are trying to figure out what the edges of that knowledge are, because it turns out that the very first moment and the very last moment of the gap aren't exactly the same moment everywhere in the galaxy. They're close, but there's some wiggle room. So the Starfinder Society wants to go and say, okay, what's the last thing this civilization knows? What's the last thing this civilization knows? And try and push those quarter back as far as possible. And that's no different than, say, people who have the Large Hadron Collider and are trying to push back the scientific lack of knowledge. And it's an ongoing lifetime, many lifetime endeavor. So those are the sorts of things that we find interesting as a background element, rather than saying that this campaign will be about this great mystery. Because if we do that, then either you don't find the answer, in which case, why on earth did you go on this big adventure? Or you find the answer, but in that case, that entire element of the campaign is no longer in place.
I blame aboleths. It's always aboleths.
We literally have a flow chart in a different office that says, did aboleths do it? And everything points to no. Of course, we also have a flow chart that says everything's Cosmo's fault. So maybe our flow charts aren't perfect.
It's definitely a possibility. Let me just take a quick check, make sure I didn't miss any questions.
So while you're doing that, can I pop a few?
Yeah, go for it.
Where is the nearest retailer where I can get Jarl Slayer armor? Because I'm short, and that needs to be a thing. But a more serious question: you had mentioned earlier while you were talking about the damage system. Can you talk about a little bit about how the damage system is different and how that's going to affect compatibility with Pathfinder characters coming in?
It won't affect compatibility. It relatively won't affect compatibility. It does not affect compatibility with monsters. If you pick up a monster from Pathfinder and you go through our legacy chapter and make the few adjustments we need, that monster should give you a satisfying experience. However, we have done different things to produce related numbers than were done in Pathfinder. So, example, Pathfinder assumes that you are going to make more and more and more attacks, and those attacks are going to, relative to your opponents, become more and more and more accurate. Which means you really, really, really need to get as many accuracy bonuses as you can and to make as many attacks as possible, because that will maximize those two benefits. The problem with that is that accuracy isn't particularly interesting, right? It's nice to be a marksman, for example, but if you are a player and you're told you can either have this sword go from being +1 to +2, or you can have this sword do a whole bunch of special things, they're probably going to pick the special things because those are more fun. Those are more interesting. Very few people get really excited about their +1 becoming a +2. Some people who are real system mechanics, and I admit I'm one of them, can get really excited about that, especially if you're manipulating a bunch of things. Oh, I'm raising my dex, and I'm using this special ability, and I'm taking this feat. So when other people are at +4, I'm at +9. Isn't that exciting? Well, maybe. But it would be more exciting if being at +4 is still effective, but I'm at +4 while flying and shooting flaming shurikens out of my hands and causing anything that happens to be an evil dragon to explode. That's just a more interesting set of elements to add to a story. So accuracy bonuses are quite rare. They do exist, but we've dialed way back on them, and we've had instead damage scale up significantly, which also means that we don't need iterative attacks. The way our game works, everyone can make one attack as a standard action, or 2 attacks as a full action, but they're both at -4, so you're actually giving up accuracy. And at much higher levels, some of the fighting people get more options than that, but the same basic idea takes place. We don't want you to be in a place where you need to make 9 attack rolls because you're a high-level, dual-wielding, hasted, raging barbarian monk with a bite attack, and the last 4 of those rolls are really unlikely to hit, but you got to roll them just in case you get lucky because that's part of your damage. We'd much rather you go, okay, I take trusty Sunspitter, my holy plasma cannon, and I shoot twice the thing. Does it blow up or not? And we check that, and then we move on. So those are some of the places where how we do damage has worked differently. But for the end user, there isn't a significant difference, right? It's still going to be, I've got an attack roll, some things add to my attack roll for my bonus. I've got a weapon, it does damage, tells me how much damage I do. I get to add a specialization bonus to that. There are some other abilities that kick in, but really you don't have to know anything different. In fact, it's harder to make a character that is less effective. That's not to say you can't do it. It's still a D20 game. You certainly can, but one of the advantages that we've got item levels means that if you are about 6th level and you know, well, I've got a 4th level gun and I've got 7th level armor, you are at about the right range. You're doing fine.
Okay. All right. Walt, any other questions? You said you had a couple.
No, but I just want to say that I self-identify as a dual-wielding, raging, biting barbarian. So thank you for that.
With a bite attack.
Yeah, I mean,
with a bite attack.
If you critically fail on a bite attack, what happens?
In normal Pathfinder, nothing, right? Unless you're using a critical hit deck. And if you're using a critical hit deck, if you fail on a Pathfinder, on a bite attack, you can accidentally bite yourself in the spleen. So the range, depending on what optional rules you use, are pretty big. The other thing that I know about bite attacks, I'm actually, my wife, who's a much bigger geek than I am, is running a Reign of Winter Pathfinder campaign right now. And I am playing a half-orc Inquisitor in that game who has the toothy trait, so he has a bite attack. The main thing I've discovered about a bite attack is that when you use it, everyone in your group is squicked out. Every time Pim was like, a dire round attacks you, like, well, I don't have time to draw my sword, I bite it. Everyone else in the room goes, ew! So that's another potential issue with bite attacks.
I'm a little squicked out myself. So, Abe, Walt, Jacob, any questions about Starfinder?
Nothing specific. I'm just excited to get a chance. It's 2 weeks. I'll finally have a copy.
All right, cool. Abe? Abe, are you still there?
I think he fell asleep.
It is pretty late back in the UK. So.
Hello, I'm here.
There we go.
Sorry, I had a lot of internet interference, and then it all sounded a bit Tardisy and Dalek-y, so I decided to mute myself in case I had a problem. No, I'm just fascinated. I didn't play a lot of Pathfinder, but this is something like the next step up, and this sounds particularly interesting. So I should probably have to tune into this as well. So,
following along with the blog, you guys had been starting to detail Pathfinder Starfinder license compatibility. Can you talk about your third party guys? Because I know there's a lot. Like Jacob is one. There's a lot of guys out there who are excited to produce material for this. Can you talk about that and your company's view on that?
Sure. So as you say, there are a lot of third parties who are very, very interested to be doing this stuff. Normally, we don't necessarily do a lot of third party support for a book right off the bat. We sort of let the book be out there, and then people have an opportunity to pick it up, and then they can use the OGL and produce stuff. But when Paizo announced the Starfinder compatibility license, they also said, hey, if you're a third-party publisher and you meet these criteria and you turn in a Starfinder compatibility license, there is an opportunity for you to get a set of material that will let you make Starfinder compatible material day one. So if you go to Paizo.com, on the left, there is a radio button you can click, not a radio button, just a button you can click for Starfinder, and you can go down to the third-party forums. Lord Morum on the forums there has put together a list of announced things, and this isn't necessarily everything, but LPJ Designs is doing Infinite Space. Rusted Iron Games has a Starfarer, so there's a ship and crew line. Frog God Games has announced a Tome of Aliens, which I think is pretty self-explanatory, and the Planetarium. Legendary Games plans to do the Legendary Planet modules and support for those. Fat Goblins Games has Pirates of the Starstream and Cosmic Odyssey. And Rogue Genius Games has the Starfarer's Companion and the Adventure of Blood Space and Moondust. So that's all, and that's stuff that we're all of us are hoping to have out either day one or pretty closely after day one. There are some other people. There's a Red Shirts Comedy Adventure Kickstarter. John Brazier Enterprises intends to do races, but they haven't, that I've seen, said exactly what. So there's a bunch of stuff out there that's going to be available, and people are talking about that right now on those Paizo.com forums. And that's also where we have preview blogs, and you can frequently interact with the developers and the creators in the forums, and we have, you know, sales and specials and subscriptions and such. So there's a lot of good content at Paizo.com if you're interested in Starfinder. We've been doing 2 or 3 preview blogs a week for like the past 3 months. It's nearly another product worth of material so that we can tell people what this is like and what's coming and what's interesting. We also have things that we have previewed that some of our partners are doing. Ninja Division is doing pre-painted figures for both some of the iconic characters and starships. Sirenscape is going to be doing a soundboard for it, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of good stuff on there that if you've got any interest in things that aren't just Paizo RPG products, I recommend going to Paizo.com and taking a look. And of course, most of that stuff is for sale there too. Paizo has its own online store, which has a lot of good material.
And speaking of online stuff, do you guys plan on doing support for like some of the online tabletops such as Roll20?
Nothing has been announced.
No, okay. Vague canon. Got it.
Although I believe that Paizo has put their banner strictly behind Fantasy Grounds for running like Pathfinder Society.
Well, and Eric, for that matter, Eric Moda, our publisher, has talked about us having Hero Lab support. But I have not seen official announcements of any of those things. So I tend to point people at our forums and tell them to knock themselves out rather than risk getting anyone's hopes up and having a release date or an exact product wrong.
Okay, all right, gotcha. Well, you had mentioned someone was releasing a ship supplement, because my first thought when I hear, you know, science fantasy is, all right, you can play as, you know, the D&D version of the Serenity Crew or the D&D version of, you know, pick your favorite sci-fi franchise, and you know, you can be the crew from Killjoys out finding bounties in the universe, that kind of thing. So that sounds like a lot of fun. What sort of campaign are you looking forward? Or hell, you're probably in the playtest. What kind of campaign are you playing in or running in for Starfinder?
I'm not currently in a Starfinder game. The playtest campaigns have mostly wrapped up, and a lot of them were using slightly different version of the rules. I did have a Dwarven Solarian named Rothar Ironstar, and I snuck the Ironstar name into the game when it comes to the dwarves. I am looking forward to playing some of the stuff you were talking about, honestly, right? A crew on a starship that's a small, scrappy band out to try and do what they can, where they can, when they can, but probably can't save the entire galaxy. I think that Guardians of the Galaxy Serenity type model is really interesting. I'm actually really looking forward to seeing what other people do. I've had people tell me that they plan to do things that are inspired by Battlestar Galactica or the Yamato anime that became Star Blazers in America, or even things like Shadowrun that wouldn't even use a starship at all, or Gamma World post-apocalyptic stuff. So these are all the sorts of things that I know what we've done and what we've built this for, and we have stress tested that in a lot of ways. But on the 17th, this is going to go from having been seen by scores and scores of people to having been seen by thousands and thousands of people. And within an hour, the number of man hours that fans have looked at it will exceed the number of hours we've looked at it. So I'm really interested in seeing what they decide are neat ideas and what they are going to use this game for.
I gotta confess, I've got this horrible idea to do a Space Captain Harlock.
I don't think that's a terrible idea at all, right? I mean, we've got space pirates in the Pact world, so we mention them and everything. I think it's a great idea.
Anybody seen that movie from 2013, that CGI?
Oh yeah,
I've seen. Yeah, cool.
Yeah. I just have to find people who want to play it, and then try to make it happen. Which
don't you threaten us with a good time and you know, some digital online tabletop?
Harlock, yeah.
So
you heard it here, folks. Mike has offered to run a game of Captain Harlock in Starfinder.
I'm coming down with emphysema. I don't know. I've got lung cancer. I'm going to have to cook some meth so I can afford the medical bills.
Doing more My Youth in Arcadia or more Galaxy Express 999, or where in Captain Harlock's career are you looking at here?
Oh, I've only seen that movie from 2013. So there's a whole lot. And there's
a ton of canon to catch up, my friend.
Yeah.
Then there's that space train.
That's Galaxy Express.
Galaxy Express, and it's God.
Although you say Galaxy Express, it reminds me of Futurama. And that's probably closer to the kind of campaign I would wind up running.
I think probably a lot of people will end up running Futurama because they'll sit around with pretzels and root beer and have a good time and laugh and not take anything seriously.
Well, I think that's a fun way. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't want to tell people how to have fun. So if that's a good time for them, I've enjoyed that kind of game. And B, if they buy the rule book, we're happy.
No, I hear you. Just back in the days of 3.0. So way back in the day, I had a DM friend who was always upset about you've probably seen the meme where, what's the campaign the GM envisions, and it's like a cutscene from Excalibur or Lord of the Rings, and what winds up being played, and it's a scene from Holy Grail or Your Highness or something like that. That's sometimes those guys come into your house with Mountain Dew and Cheetos, aren't on board with, epic poetry, and they're just wanting to, crack wise and have a good time. So,
and sometimes a game starts really, really, really seriously, but you play until 3 o'clock in the morning and everyone gets punchy, and then you got paladins swinging clerics around their head by a rope so they can throw them over the Grand Canyon.
Yeah, I had a meeting some Mastermind second ed game where we figured out the blunt force damage a ninja would do if you used them as a melee weapon.
Exactly.
So yeah.
Because sometimes you have to hit a dude with another dude.
Indeed, sometimes you do. So, Owen, how much of your life have you spent working on Starfinder at this point?
Months, years? For the past year and a half, almost. Let's see. We started working on it in maybe March of last year.
Okay.
So, yeah, just about a year and a half. It's been a lot of late nights in some cases. That was to get the core rulebook out. It hasn't been as bad now, although the Alien Archive also had some heavy time. It's the majority of what I do at Paizo at the moment is working on this, and that the job title change, I think, shows that the current plan is for me, and for that matter the rest of the Starfinder team, to keep producing this material at least for the foreseeable future.
Oh yeah.
I think about Starfinder when I go to bed at night, and I've got a new idea for Starfinder when I wake up in the morning. So it's been an important part of my life recently.
So where do you go for inspiration? I'm just like, if I was interviewing a guy who's working on, let's say it's 10 years ago, you're working on Pathfinder 3.0. I'm going to be like, well, you're doing all these 60-hour weeks developing the system. I'm guessing every weekend you put on Krull or Lord of the Rings or something to recharge your creative batteries. For Starfinder, where were you going for inspiration or to decompress?
Well, so first of all, Krull is great for Starfinder, right? The beast comes from outer space, and that the main character's child is destined to run the galaxy. A Krull sequel as an RPG would make a perfect Starfinder game.
I hadn't considered that. Cool.
You can. I tend to go to the pulps. I'm a big fan of E.E. Smith and the Lensman series.
The Grey Lensman, yes.
Yeah. He also did Skylark. So a lot of that sort of space opera type stuff, to me, has very much the same feel, because technically, sure, Lensman isn't a science fantasy series, but you're talking about people that have a super intelligent race of beings who can foresee the future based on just envisioning the present and extrapolating, who can make a bracelet that gives you super psychic powers and allows you to manipulate things with your minds, and they are facing 12th dimensional beings that can't even be described rationally. Science fantasy, and that's one of my very early influences. And then you've got Valerian Space Marines with space axes, so even melee weapons get into that particular scene.
Make it sound so much cooler than the Green Lantern Corps.
Well, and they predate the Green Lantern Corps, so
like 50 years, yeah.
I'm a big fan of that, and I think some of those elements get into a lot of fantasy, right? One of the things that people have asked me about Starfinder is, hey, how are you going to do melee weapons in a science fantasy game when everyone's got a blaster? And I'm like, well, Klingons have disruptors, but they still carry a lot of batleths, don't they? Andromeda had the lance thing, the name of which does not immediately escape me. They had a similar staff weapon on Babylon 5. You've got lightsabers, which are sort of the iconic science fiction melee weapon. I think most sort of space opera inspired, even if it's moved on to a different genre of science fiction, somebody has an iconic melee weapon. And so those are the sort of things that inspire me to go, hey, this is fun and interesting stuff. Do we have a way to do something like this? I mean, one of the traps in the trap section of Starfinder happens to be a room that the two sides can move in and, compact you. There's a lot of this sort of stuff that's just sprinkled through popular science fantasy, and so nearly anything will recharge my batteries. The other thing is that I think, a dragon with a plasma cannon on its shoulder is cool, so I will also just do straight up traditional fantasy, even anime, to look at ideas and say, hey, that's something that might be interesting. Do we have a way to do something that would be satisfying for people who are fans of this?
Okay, cool. So looking at past, sci-fi RPGs that you've played, or, can you think of particular sci-fi RPGs that you found, particularly enjoyable, or ones that maybe, near misses for you?
I have been a huge fan of nearly every version of Gamma World. Gamma World is in many ways the first science fantasy game. I mean, maybe Metamorphosis Alpha, which was sort of the inspiration for it, predates it. I'm not sure if that was as science fantasy, but in Gamma World, you instead of a whole bunch of different races necessarily, you've got mutants, but that means once two people are playing that mutant, it's a new race. And psychic powers are common, and high tech is common, and yet you still mostly get to stomp about a dungeon and shoot things without feeling bad about it. I think that's a very easy science fantasy RPG concept to get behind, and I've enjoyed a lot of different games like that. Similarly, I'm a big fan of the world of Rifts. I'm not a big fan of the system for Rifts. That's one of the reasons I was so happy to see that you can now play Rifts in Savage Worlds.
Yep.
Obviously, I worked on 3 editions of D20 Star Wars, so that has had some influence on what I think of as a good science fantasy game. But I've played a bunch of them, and I think all of them have something to be said for them. And a lot of them, the question of is it good or is it bad is going to come down to personal preference.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, we kind of talked about this a lot last week. Favorite sci-fi RPGs. I haven't really had a great science fiction, RPG experience. I've done a couple of the old Star Wars games from, like the D6 days, way back in the day. Played a low-level Jedi, which was just enough to give you a taste and let you know how exciting it could be when you got a little bit higher Jedi. But my campaigns never seemed to last that long. So anyway, so favorite science fiction movies, novels.
I'm a big fan of Star Wars. I'm a big fan of the Lensman. I'm a big fan of Star Trek, honestly. Guardians of the Galaxy has been fun recently. I really liked Jupiter Ascending, and I know a lot of people didn't, but I really liked that they were doing a very different concept for science fiction. And as far as it being goofy, I don't find it any weirder than Buck Rogers or Flash Gordon.
I agree with you, Owen. I like Jupiter Ascending.
I really like that one too.
That's a great game to get inspired by, or a great movie to get inspired by.
Yeah, my only problem was the climax was kind of, there was a lot of the set is shaking and we're going to fall down these giant holes, which that's kind of a failing of the cinematic sci-fi genre in general. But I dug it as well. So
I have a quick question about the release of the product on the 17th.
Okay.
Well, not so much the date, but more about the product itself. Back in the day when you guys released the Pathfinder core book as a PDF, I used to tell people, because they would I used to work in tech, and sometimes people would ask me, hey, is this tablet any good? And I would say, put the Pathfinder RPG book on it. If you don't have to wait 15 minutes, make a sandwich, and have a cup of coffee to go from page 1 to page 4, then it's a good tablet. How is this going to look on mobile devices, and how's it going to scroll through for anything like maybe 2 or 3 years old to current?
So if you look at the Pathfinder RPG, you will see that there is a lot of faded graphic elements, and the background, this color comes all the way into like here. It is not shock white at all, and all of those elements eat up a fair amount of processing space. Now they now have light versions of those PDFs, so you can get the Pathfinder rulebook. And once you bought it, you can download either the full version or a light version. And the light version is much less brutal on something like a tablet. If you look at the Starfinder RPG, you'll see that there is a simple, crisp line here, and then it's white. It's white with black text on it, the way words were meant to be presented. And I've got terrible eyesight, so I'm a little grumpy about a lot of modern RPGs that do a whole lot of stuff with a gentle fade from an off ecru sort of through a champagne towards maybe a light tan. Visually more interesting. We're trying in this book, and Sarah Robinson, who did this book, just has made an incredibly gorgeous book. For the most part, she has made this book gorgeous by having a simple treatment and interesting headers, and then art of rat folk with flamethrowers.
Because that's what you need.
I do not have a few-year-old tablet to download it and put it on. What I have heard anecdotally is because there are now people getting the PDF. We are shipping out to subscribers, and when we ship your book out to you, if you're a subscriber, you get a free PDF, and the PDF gets downloaded. So even though it doesn't get released for 13 days, as of I think yesterday, a few people have it. And what I've heard from them anecdotally so far is this is not the kind of memory hog that the original Pathfinder book was. And indeed, last I heard, we don't have a light version of this because we don't need one. That it will be pretty accessible for people. If that turns out not to be the case, if we get a big feedback that it's a problem, then obviously that's something we would look at. The other thing is that we usually give you the option to download each chapter as its own PDF, and normally you don't need to look at 3 chapters all at once anyway, so it's another way to not put nearly as heavy a strain on your device.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of Reynolds' artwork, and a lot of the artwork. Every time Paizo releases a product, it's not only gorgeous, but it's visually intoxicating. You guys make gorgeous products. So I have almost your entire product line on PDF because I just don't have the space to have like a giant catalog like that. Especially because what you're not seeing in the video is the other wall where my wife has like 3 6-foot bookshelves with all her horror stuff that she likes. So I don't have the room. So to have a PDF that I can look at and scroll through quickly, that's fantastic. And I didn't know that about the Pathfinder, that they had retooled it to work on devices like that. So I'm gonna have to go and download that again. So that's fantastic. Yeah, for everything, there should maybe not everything, but for the vast majority of stuff, the hardbacks anyway, you can get a light version, which is much less strain on your system. I mean, I don't have a brand new computer, right? And I do most of my stuff in PDF too. I did not, when I moved from Oklahoma to Seattle, the vast majority of my physical library did not come with me. It was given away or sold off to friends to help fund the move. So I do almost everything on PDF, and my machine's 3 or 4 years old at this point. So those light PDFs are a real time and frustration saver for me. Now, are you guys going to have like a special edition of the book too? Like I thought I saw somewhere a black cover with some silvery accents. Is there any sort of like special covers coming out or anything?
There's holographs or lenticulars, or go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, there. I say it's sold out, at least on Paizo.com. There was a special edition that is a dark blue leatherette cover with a silver symbol of the Pact Worlds on it. Turns out it was popular. It may still be in distribution. I honestly don't know.
Hey, Owen, I missed a question from Reddit. I apologize. It was let me pull it up here. It was the guy who was asking about power armor and pawns, and I got all excited about that stuff that I missed his very first sentence. So from Not All Fun, will there be options for solo playerships like a fighter in the core book?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Right on.
Can you go into detail on that, or is it just, hey, you get to find out when it comes out, kids?
They're talking about that a little bit on the Paizo forums. I don't want to eat up a whole lot of time with it, but I mean, we've got them, and you can play them. That's not the core assumption. That's sort of like running around in Pathfinder with a chariot. That there are rules there. You can do it. We don't assume that that's what most people are doing most of the time, but certainly it's an option. There are rules for it. You shouldn't find it mysterious or hard to figure out.
Okay. So ship-to-ship combat. Let's say you want to, go raid the Starfinder version of the Death Star, and, fight some TIE fighters or do whatever. Did you get? I mean, I know back in the day, D20 didn't have an incredibly vigorous vehicle combat system. What do you guys have for Starfinder?
Well, we have a vehicle combat system, which is for vehicles interacting with player characters, and that's for things like hover police cruisers and lifter bikes and submarines and stuff. For starships, we have a starship combat system, and it works a little differently than the regular combat section. It has its own chapter where everyone has a role that they engage in during combat. So someone is being the pilot, and someone is taking the captain or coordinator role. Someone's being the science officer, someone's being the engineer, some people are being the gunners. And you have a set of actions that you can attempt using the same skills and abilities that you use as a regular character. So the idea is that you don't have to build a character differently just because your game happens to have a starship. And starship combat occurs on a hex grid because it's out in space, and we found that more useful for our general maneuvering. And it's a new system, and so it's one of the very first things that we playtest extensively back at Gamma. A lot of people got to play it. Jason Bullman and Jason Keeley, who are sort of our Starship experts, ran it for several people. Everyone I've seen play with it has had a good time with it, so I've got really good feelings about it. But it is something that you can have as part of your campaign if you want a lot of Starship-related stuff, or know what the rules are so that on the rare occasion it comes up, you can touch on it, and then the rest of the time your team is an away team, and you walk away from the shuttle, and you have to deal with things on a one-on-one basis. So we tried to make it complete enough to have a robust experience without eating up another 30 or 50 pages of the book beyond what it already does. But it's also something I'm sure we'll expand on as the game goes beyond just the core rules.
Okay, cool. Well, hey, we have gone a lot longer than we usually go on our little podcast shows. Aid, any questions before we wrap up? We've been kind of quiet today.
I'm just happy to listen. Happy to listen.
I was waiting for you to ask about if you could simulate playing a British time traveler with a spaceship that was larger on the inside.
I'm sure that's possible.
Walt, how about you?
Just one more quick question, and very short answer. Starship movement and combat, Star Wars or The Expanse?
Star Wars.
Cool. Right on.
Jacob, how about you?
Nothing from me. I've just been glad to hear some of this stuff because I haven't heard some of this, so it's been really great.
Okay, cool. Owen, any closing thoughts?
Just a lot of people seem to like the game. We put a lot of time and effort into the game. The one thing we haven't touched on here that I want to make sure is clear, the Pathfinder core rulebook is not designed for someone who's never role-played before, or even for someone who is not familiar with the game to pick up and be able to play it. It is a product of its time. The core audience for it was not new role-players. Starfinder, we think, has a good chance to bring new people into the hobby, or at least people that are not necessarily familiar with Pathfinder and that entire style of games. So we have done a lot of work, and Amanda Hammond-Coons has done a heroic job with this goal of making it much, much newbie. It will say, this is what a role-playing game is, and here's an example of play. And if you want to make your character, here are some steps to go through, and this is the order they go in, and this is why you want to do them. So that even though, yes, it's a more than 500-page book, it's big and intimidating, but unlike the Pathfinder core rulebook, it doesn't assume you know what you're doing when you first pick it up. And that's a product of it being a different kind of product, shooting at a different audience. But I know a lot of people have been intimidated by the size. This is options, right? This is a 20-level game. That means that we need spells and equipment and gear and feat options for 20 levels. If you all are making first-level characters, the most of that book you're not using. And we will walk you through the pieces you are. So I think it's going to be a much easier game to get into, and I want to encourage people to give it a try.
Let me just ask you, towards the noble goal of getting more gamers, newbies into the gaming hobby, are you guys going to be making a push to get into more of the, direct channel, Walmart's, Borders, Barnes & Noble? I guess, forget I said Borders because I'm a time traveler from 7 years ago. Barnes & Nobles, that kind of stuff, Targets?
Where it makes economic sense and where they seem interested, yes. Where it doesn't, no. a fairly complicated and largely above my pay grade or even my knowledge base kind of question. So I do know that's going to be showing up some places people might not expect till day of. I believe there are already some people talking about finding it in Barnes & Noble, for example.
Breaking the street date. Shame on you, Barnes & Noble. All right.
Well, and my understanding is that Barnes & Noble simply misunderstood which day it was and took it back off the shelves. And that's anecdotal. But we do want this game to be available. I mean, I still think most people are going to go pick it up at their friendly local game store, and obviously we want to support those stores because those stores, their play spaces. But it's also available online from a lot of different places, and we are trying to get it into some more. I don't want to say trying. There has been some movement on getting it into some more mass market places, but those efforts are done by people other than me. They don't comment on how good a job I'm doing on game design, so I'm not going to comment on what they are or aren't succeeding at or even trying when it comes to what venues they want to sell the game in.
Oh, it's cool. Yeah, I was just curious because this was one of those perennial subjects is, gamers are getting older. How do we get new blood into the hobby? So, talking to the guy who's the lead developer on Starfinder, he's a good person to ask about that. So.
Yeah, totally. And we wanted to make sure that if you have a decent reading level, you can get into it. I actually think that probably Starfinder Society organized play is going to be the main way that new, younger people move in. I'm always impressed when I go to the Sagamore Ballroom at Gen Con, how many young gamers are in there. I mean, hundreds, maybe thousands, playing games and enjoying them, many of them doing it at a much younger age than I got into the hobby.
To the starting and younger audience, Paizo is pretty good about releasing things through a lot of different licensing. Are you going to be doing stuff like maybe a beginner box, or they have comics and novels for Pathfinder? Are they looking at stuff for Starfinder to do that?
Anything Pathfinder has done, we are looking at. That just is good business sense. Whether or not they'll happen involves a whole lot of decisions, and that brings me back to the nothing announced yet statement.
Okay, all right. Well, I think we're getting to the point where we need to wrap up. I've got to take care of some things on my day job, I know. Owen, it's always a pleasure to have you. Thank you very much for coming to talk to us today.
Thank you very much for having me. I had a great time.
And to all our listeners and the folks from the Reddit subforum who showed up, I appreciate you guys coming out. Thanks to our co-hosts, and we will catch you next time on the BAMF podcast.